Hi, everyone. Nate here. Just a quick heads up that if you enjoy What a Hell of a Way to Die, you can access bonus content in which we publish a new episode every week on our Patreon. The link is in the show notes, and for $5 a month, you get access to all the bonus content we've put out since we started the show back in 2016. Hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. He ain't gonna jump no more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is me and Nate, and today I have with me the author Matt Gallagher, author of Kaboom, Youngblood, and his new novel, Empire City. We're going to talk about the most recent book. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Nate. How are you?
Great. Living in England, neck and neck for the dumbest country on the planet next to America. So on one hand, I feel a surge of pride when I see America take the pole position, but then other times it's just like, then I have to remind myself that whoever wins, we lose. How are you, man? You've been in New York for the entirety of this pandemic, haven't you?
For the vast majority, my family and I just came down last week to spend the summer in Virginia at my mom's. We have a toddler and a dog, so we needed some space. But yeah, we waited out the vast majority of the Corona time in our tiny apartment in Brooklyn. So a lot of memories formed during those months.
I can only imagine. Yeah, when I lived in New York, I lived in a place that was probably maybe 300 square feet, and with my wife, of course. And so when we moved here, we moved into a bigger place in November, and we were just thinking to ourselves, like, there was an extent to which I felt like this immense pride and anguish for New York, because obviously you feel like a New Yorker, and also like it was home for so long, but then also reminding myself, like, I would not be faring very well in a 300 square foot apartment if I was forbidden from going outside for weeks on end. So I have no idea how you survived with toddler, but you were an American hero for that.
I appreciate that. You really didn't have any choice. So got to spend a lot of quality family time that I hope to never ever relive again.
Yeah, I totally imagine. So Empire City just came out. And if I were to hazard a brief summary of it, I would call it a work of military speculative fiction based on, well, an alternate version of history in which the U.S. basically won Vietnam but was at war forever since the 90s. And a very, very different course of history has played out. I don't know if that's a fair summary or if you would want to refine that.
No, I think that really covers it. Kind of the initial question, the seed question that led to me creating this world and writing this novel was kind of like in our reality, this weird dichotomy, this weird cognitive dissonance that America has toward the idea of empire, right? That just look at where we're at everywhere in the world. We meet all technical definitions of that term. But we're kind of bashful about it as a citizenry, right? That the machinations that we go through to pretend that we're not is just kind of bizarre to me, right? And it's played out that way in our history. And I just kind of got really interested in the ways that were similar, but also different than the empires that preceded us, specifically ancient Rome and High Britain. And I started thinking about, what would be a way for me to create kind of an openly brash imperial America. No throat clearing. We're an empire because somebody has to fill this role in vacuum. That's how national security folks talk. That is not how everyday citizens talk in our world. So I wanted to create a world like that. And a lot of it, particularly for folks of our generation, I think, it goes back to Vietnam. We kind of inherited this bashful sense of American might from our parents, right? Who had to make the choice in their youth due to the circumstances of the Vietnam War and its role in American culture and on American society. So, it's a bit different than a lot of speculative fictions, than a lot of alternate histories, right? That kind of have kind of obvious trigger mechanism, which is, what if the South won? What if the Nazis won? That's something a very simple concept to understand. What if America won the Vietnam War is a little less obvious, but my hope and ambition with Empire City was to show some pretty damning consequences from it, and to really kind of explore the central question of what are the real costs of victory.
So that all makes sense, and I wanted to say that I really admire the world building in this novel, but I do have to ask, this is your second novel, was there ever a moment at which in the process of creating this where you thought to yourself, I am in over my fucking head?
Pretty much every day. Second novels are infamously troublesome beasts, and being aware of that ahead of time did me no favors whatsoever, even though I thought that it might. Both of my previous works, Kaboom and Youngblood, they were kind of, even Youngblood, which is a novel, it's a set reality, right? It's based on the Iraq that I served in. It's based in our world. The left and right limit were built in. Building an alternate world from scratch seemed like a great idea. After a couple beers, I jotted down some great ideas on some bar napkins and stuff. But once I got, waist deep in it, it was a challenge, unlike any other I'd really dealt with as a writer before. The big complicated things like figuring out a way for America to quote unquote win the Vietnam War. I mean, that was challenging. I had to talk to a bunch of historians to figure out something believable enough, even for a work of fiction. But then even little things, man, on the sentence level. I early on, I found myself writing a throwaway line about hipster jeans. And then I just kind of had to sit back and be like, would hipsters even exist in this world? And you trace it back, and, in this world, the Vietnam War protesters are arrested and jailed and shunned from society. And they're older people in this world now, but they're still deeply embarrassed. And this is something they've been humiliated, kind of shunned for what they did in their youth. And, in our world, so much of fashion can be traced back to the countercultural movement, right? And the fact that they weren't embarrassed, they were proud that, history by and large has proven them correct. So, I had to order fashion books about this, stuff that I don't know anything about, to, try to come up with just kind of a different way that fashion trends would have evolved differently over the course of these 35 years. And, that's just kind of one goofy small example of what I had to deal with every day with the world building. That said, as much of a challenge as it was, ultimately hearing readers like you or reviewers say that resonated with them, that the world building clicked with them, that's the most fulfilling part of it, because I didn't know if I could do that yet when I started writing this thing.
Well, I have to ask also, though, I mean, I imagine there might have been a temptation to just have it be, like you said, a bounded left and right limit, normal American history that has just become more militarized and Praetorian in the future, because it seems like that's entirely possible based on our current trajectory. And so, in a way, I'm just wondering, was that ever on the cards, or did you know from day one that you wanted to create, like you said, this entire alternate timeline?
Yeah, I think I considered it, and it just felt, I just knew I could do it, I guess. I need to be, I think I'm just one of those writers that I need to be a little scared of what I'm doing. I've written more than my fair share about contemporary war and issues of moral culpability and stuff. And I don't know, I think the fact, I've written about this stuff so much, and an image I couldn't shake, Nate, when I was wrestling with this question was you've dealt with this too when you talk to people about your work. Really smart people, in MFA land, well-read people. Once they hear about our subject, something in their eyes die, right? That light
yes,
goes off. And I don't know what that is. I've spent way too much time trying to figure that out. And I think one of my hopes of creating an alternate world was, maybe some of those people, that light wouldn't go off. That, like, by creating a speculative world, in the tradition of the Man in the High Castle, Bring On the Jubilee by Ward Moore.
I kept thinking of Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, and I thought to myself, like, is this sort of like what would be happening on planet Earth while they were in space? I mean, in a way, that was sort of that was the first thought that came to mind.
Haldeman was a big influence on me as well. This is kind of a proud literary tradition that I thought maybe some of those people who didn't sit down with Youngblood or Kaboom, maybe they might give this a chance and explore these issues that I think are important and worth exploring in literature. Maybe they'll pick up Empire City and don't necessarily have to agree with my takeaways or conclusions from it, but maybe just engage with the topic and themes.
Well, and one final thing with regard to the world building, I just have to say that okay, you and I have talked previously, and you said this was a project that was a long time in the making, and I feel like if we were to go back to, say, 2015, and then we tell our 2015 selves that the top headline on the day that we're recording this in June 2020 is that a tell-all from John Bolton reveals that President Donald Trump made it a special point to try and deliver a CD of the Elton John song Rocket Man to Kim Jong-un. It would seem like a really ham-fisted parody. And so given that you've been writing this book for almost the same timeline, if I'm not mistaken, I'm wondering, did you ever feel as though like maybe the reality you built wasn't weird enough?
Oh yeah, a big without giving away too much to listeners. One of the dominant secondary characters is a retired general who becomes a politician, and creating her worldview and her politics. Like, I realized, during the early parts of the Trump presidency, I realized that, like, early drafts, I was reacting to the headlines too much, and it was coming out stupid because reality is stupid. Reality is really fucking stupid right now. And kind of a light clicked on in that when I realized, hey, this has to be, the politics in Empire City have to be smarter than we're experiencing and seeing, because I can't outdumb this. So it needs to be its own thing. It needs to be built on its own logic. And, I ultimately really put a decent amount of my own politics into this character, Jackie Collins, to do that, because, John Bolton, John Kelly, Trump, this whole rogues gallery of idiocy that we've all had to deal with and contend with. And I'm still so fucking angry that 4 years of our lives have been devoted to watching these fools blunder to and fro. That, trying as much as I could to not let that idiocy seep into my novel. It was an ongoing fight, and hopefully, if nothing else, that even the political villains in Empire City, I'd like to think, have more nuance and dimensionality than the politicians we have in England and America currently.
Yeah, and I was actually going to segue right into talking about General Collins, the character, and so for without spoiling much of the plot, I would just say that we're talking about the retired general who becomes a politician. We're talking about a veteran, a fringe or extremist veterans organization called Mayday, who are seeking to undo policies that have basically put disabled and or disturbed veterans in not quite offshore colonies, but basically colonies in which they are medicated and supervised. And you're also, one of the characters is a former Army helicopter pilot whose first name is Mia, who lost her leg in combat and has gone from working in finance to now working on General Collins's campaign. And my question, I guess, from having laid out that groundwork, is that it feels like at the end, when you learn what General Collins has been party to, mm-hmm. without giving up any of the details, you could come away with the impression that what Mayday were arguing for was correct. But you could also come away from it via the perspective that Mia seems to take away, which is that this is politics, this is how the world works, incrementalism is at least an improvement. Now, I guess I don't know if that ambiguity was intentional, if that's just my reading, but I wonder, have you had people present you with that, in like that sort of those two split interpretations, that like radicalism is the answer versus incrementalism is the answer based on their read of your book.
Yeah, it was intentional, and hearing from readers being very polarized on that very thing has been super interesting. I heard from somebody I went to a writers' conference with last summer say that Mia was her favorite character, and in many ways this person shares Mia's politics and worldview. Mia comes from a Wall Street family. She's allowed the space and privilege to believe in incrementalism, right? These ideas are notional and theoretical to her. It doesn't mean that she doesn't believe in them, but the day-to-day impact on her life is minimal, right? Versus some of the other characters who come from different social classes, served in, Mia was not a helicopter pilot officer, right? That was intentional too, right? Her job in the Army was literally physically removed from the consequences of her actions for the most part, right? Like we as middle class Americans, we've been trained from birth not to side with these kind of ideas and aspirational radical pushes, but they have their reasoning, right? And they deserve that dimensionality. They deserve to make their case to the reader as much as anyone. And a lot of that, if I'm being honest with myself, is probably coming from my own place of confusion sometimes on these ideas of accelerationism versus incrementalism, of a little bit here and there versus everything now. And depending, I think like most people, I go back and forth on that. Depends on the issue, depends on the day, and putting that into these characters and having them represent different parts of the military, different parts of American society. The other two main characters beyond Mia, one is Jean-Jacques St. Preux, who's a Haitian immigrant, comes joined the military to literally earn his citizenship, and then there's kind of the bungling middle class bureaucrat Sebastian Rios, who's kind of trapped between these two poles. And these three characters are wrestling with these ideas in the same way I think we all are, particularly in our 20s and 30s, when we're figuring out our place in the world and what we believe most stridently to be true. And it's been rewarding for readers to be picking up on that. And I think it's okay that they come away with maybe different interpretations of these characters based on their own backgrounds and perspectives. To each their own. I know as a reader, I don't like my literature to be didactic, at least my fiction. And that was, writing a piece of pronounced political fiction. That was a concern of mine as a writer. So I wanted as much as possible to put these ideas into the characters and let readers grapple with them, rather than them being like, this is what Matt Gallagher tells me to think, kind of thing.
I was going to ask a similar question with regard to St. Preux, because, or Dash, the character, because for the overwhelming majority of the book, he is basically what you might describe as a apolitical true believer, in the sense that he's just very much like he's in the military and that's all that matters. And obviously, like the circumstances that he's living in with the other volunteers puts him into contact with a lot more of what's been going on in America. But in a way, to communicate his intentions and his views, you have to basically get in the head of somebody who has been socialized into the military since he was quite young, and for whom like the mission is the only thing that really matters. How did you feel about having to write that when, my read on the overwhelming majority of your work has been that there's always a question of gray area and nuance and like uncertainty about the mission and the sort of inevitability of having to do shit you don't believe in?
Yeah, I didn't when I was in uniform and after, I didn't share Jean-Jacques' read on that, right? Like, I'd make the case that even saying I'm apolitical, all I care about is the mission is itself a political statement, right? But I knew plenty of people that believe that, and they tend to be pretty good soldiers, and probably better soldiers than I was, to be honest. And Jean-Jacques is very good at soldiering, his purpose for much of the trajectory of the novel is just to do all this shit that needs to get done. And I think readers realize by the end of his arc that he's starting to realize there's some faultiness to that approach. The carving out the space to say I'm just a soldier. I go where Uncle Sam tells me to go. While important on a macro level for a functioning republic, on a micro level, on an individual soul, that's gonna eat at you. Even if Jean-Jacques may not admit it, it's taking pieces of him each time he says it, each time he reminds himself of it. Again, that's something that I want to something that's really kind of gnawed at me as a veteran when I confront it, is this idea that you'll see amongst some liberals, honestly, well, you volunteered for it, right? And it's sometimes that's a way of absolving themselves of any kind of connection, any kind of which there's some truth to that, sure, particularly with an all-volunteer force. But it's certainly not how a republic is supposed to work. And it's always a little weird to me when you see former beatniks, former hippie types in their 60s putting all that heft of big moral and ethical issues onto young 20-somethings, many of whom joined the military not to kill people, but because it was a way of social mobility, or a way to education. All these different reasons that you all explore in your podcast for reasons why people join the military, right? So I wanted to. Jean-Jacques, I think it was just kind of a fist of a human being, right? He just kind of has always pounded his way, pushed his way through things. And it's really only there, I think, in the last 40, 50 pages where, whereas Sebastian and Mia are kind of constantly questioning and scrutinizing some of their choices, that I think readers are exposed to the fact that Jean-Jacques is going to be dealing with and reconciling with his choices, both as a soldier and as a citizen who's earned it the hard way.
It's weird because I know all of the things involved in terms of like what relates to the actual military, the things that you're not didactically, but you have to explain to the reader that there's obviously a lot of things involved with the sort of process of being a soldier, of being an officer. And I recognize all that stuff when I'm reading it, but it's, in a way, Sebastian Rios was the character that I felt I identified with the most. And I also, in a way, I kept envisioning you. I kept thinking like, oh yeah, this is civilian Matt having to deal with a bunch of square-jawed ass dudes that he's been thrown into, they're the company of, but also is inextricably linked with what happened to them to make them, have the abilities they have. And also like they have this shared history, even though it's for him a pretty much uniquely bad memory. It's a thing it's a traumatic memory for all of them, but for him in particular, there isn't any service behind it. He was a volunteer war journalist, basically trying to be a freelancer in Libya, and was witness to a military atrocity in which they were basically sacrificed, and he was one of the few survivors, and as a result, has this guilt behind it. But he just seems very adrift. And in a way, I felt like that wasn't, hitting the reader over the head. It wasn't like, this is the veteran experience, but it felt like there was an extent to which he kind of represented the dislocation of having to be a civilian. Like, you might be a veteran, but you're not in the military anymore. You have to be in this very, very, in a world where basically there is no UCMJ and the rules don't apply. And like all the things that you thought were hard and fast rules just don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly it, man. What I wanted from Sebastian, who, has some character traits similar to my own. He's trapped between two worlds, and he's stuck in a way that I think because of writing, or whatever, I was able to find some kind of solid ground while sorting through my own experiences and sorting through the disaster that was the Iraq War. Sebastian, like a lot of people we both know, is just stuck, and he doesn't know how to get out of it. He's ironic, and he's lonely, and he wants to hold on to kind of the ideals he lost overseas, but he sees the futility in that. And there's a reason I think a lot of characters in war literature kind of meet those, even well beyond GWOT literature, but going back to Marlowe, in Conrad's works, going back to O'Brien, going back to World War One. These kind of cipher type narrators function really well as a way to communicate to civilian readers. So much of war literature is kind of this howl toward the wider world that this thing happened, this was real. Reconcile with it, acknowledge it. This belongs to you, and that's certainly the case in contemporary war literature. And these tried and true cipher types. Young people, self-effacing, trapped between two worlds. I think they just kind of work in terms of delivering in that way, right? I mean, I think there's a reason, say Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and Robert Graves are much more read about the World War I trenches than say Ernst Jünger, right? A civilian reader cannot, went to school with people like Siegfried or Graves. Jünger, total badass, great writer in his own right, kind of a psycho. He's much harder to grapple with for your average, even smart, keen literary reader. So, Sebastian, there's a reason I think that the novel starts with him, even if he, as the book goes on, he's not necessarily a huge centerpiece. He's a guiding light for readers, both familiar with war literature, but being introduced to this new world, and also lay readers who maybe this might well be the first post 9/11 piece of war literature they've picked up, and I want to give them somebody that they have some passing familiarity with.
Yeah, and speaking with, I don't know, with regard to the kind of identifying it with a work of fiction, a work of speculative fiction with the present moment, the scenes involving protests, the scenes involving, crowds, throngs of people under pressure, I couldn't help but take away a weird kind of echo with the present day. And I mean, given what's going on in America with the protest movement taking place right now and the rift that it's opened up, I mean, I think you follow me on Twitter, where my views are, but from afar, it feels like we're witnessing a crisis that reveals how untenable the current situation is. Mm-hmm. And I say that obviously, like, I haven't lived in America for almost 2 years. The situation, there's a similar thing going on here, but it's very, very different. And it's based on a very, very different last decade in this country versus in the United States. And so I'm wondering, like, you watching this now, like, what are your thoughts on, like, you've created an alternate America where things are untenable. And now it feels like, it's a similar crisis point is taking place in actual America. Like, how does that feel? And what are your thoughts on it?
Mostly feel shitty. I think my hope with this would be more of a forewarning, right? That at least when I was writing this, maybe we were at a 4 or 5 out of 10, right? And versus 10 being the world in Empire City. Well, now the world has been published into. It seems like we're an 8, maybe an 8.5.
Yeah,
and. Yeah, things are untenable. The status quo has been revealed nakedly to be hollow, to be as much of a ruse and a fraud as some of the biggest skeptics have ever said it's been. That said, for a society to be stable, for society to run. There has to be some semblance of order. there also has to be some semblance of justice, and reclaiming that equilibrium seems impossible. It seems impossible. It seems impossible in the pages. As one of the protest scenes in the book is at a military processing center, right? And a group of armed vigilantes, ex-cops, ex-military, called the Sheepdogs, end up violently attacking the crowd. I wrote this thing 3 years ago, and then somebody tagged me on Twitter a couple days ago when the news of the New Mexico Civil Guard thing happened, and they're like, "Well, great prognosticating, Gallagher," I take no pleasure in being right. 98% of my corrections in life have been wrong. So it mostly just kind of sucks that the one thing I've been right about is, it was not a big sports game that I could bet money on or anything. It was American dystopia. That said, we've been there before. You know your history too. Somehow, some way, this is not unprecedented, though it's unprecedented for our generation. I believe, because I have to believe, as a father of a 3-year-old now, he just turned 3, that America will be better and stronger on the far side of this. How we get there is going to take a lot of hard conversations, a lot of hard scrutiny, and people keep showing up in the streets because, whether some of our old colleagues in uniform want to admit it or not, it's getting results. And something that a theme in Empire City that I explore, that I've been thinking about with what's going on in the news, is not just violence, but the threat of violence, right? The possibility that the masses will revolt. How central is that to the power, to the power structure, allowing for change? I think there's something there. The part of me that was raised on the sanitized speeches of Martin Luther King and Gandhi quotes doesn't want to admit that. But how could anybody paying attention right now not admit that the threat of violence, the possibility of civil unrest, isn't a huge driving factor in this? And I was uncomfortable writing that in Empire City, which is why I knew I had to write it. And I hope that's something readers wrestle with themselves when they read it. And I also hope it's something that Republicans and Democrats, whatever ideology they come from, when we watch the news right now, we're forced to confront, because it's messy. It's really hard and messy, but it's where we're at.
One of the things that struck me reading the book, there are these sort of interstitial moments where you have like press clippings, segments from book reviews, sort of government-controlled alternate version of Facebook, things along like that. And it reminded me of, I want to say probably about 2010, 2011. I got back from Afghanistan in 2010. And I started seeing stuff in and around the Tea Party movement, and then subsequently on places, specifically Facebook. I mean, we talk a lot about social media in general, but I feel like you can't really put any other networks in the same category. Facebook, particularly for people of a certain age and older, is like the prime information portal. It might as well just be the homepage of the internet for them. And the level of disinformation, specifically the level of disinformation that I would see circulated amongst people I served with, their relatives, things along those lines, started to amp up and get worse and worse and worse. And to the point where, one of my former soldiers who got a Purple Heart in Afghanistan, has become an electrical engineer, really, really smart guy, in my opinion, sees through the bullshit in a lot of ways, is very much kind of I would say probably in a similar political region of the spectrum as you and I are. I've seen the stuff his parents share online about, Antifa is controlled by George Soros and COVID-19 is a hoax and that kind of shit. And there's an extent to which I feel like I realize it's not unprecedented. What you just said is correct, that we've had periods of significant upheaval. This is just we're basically reliving a period of time or something similar to what happened, say, 50, 55 years ago. But I feel like there's also this new dimension of this like infinite possibilities of your own subjective reality to be kind of tailored and fed. And I try to fight it in my own right, because even, from my perspective, if I just wanted to home in on one political tendency all day long and that's all I would read and that's all I believe, I could do that, and it wouldn't even register that there was anything untoward or incorrect about that. In this novel, it feels like that has happened and that has come to pass, and now there's just like a very, very powerful state that controls information. Is that a correct read? And is that something that you envision? I mean, I'm not saying endorse, but something that you envision, in the future.
Yeah, that was how this is America has decided to deal with this is top level control. There's a strange relationship at the top between military, political, and private enterprise that controls much of this. But the kind of much of the First Amendment in this world has been rolled back, if not in an obvious way, in a way that's supposed to cue to readers that has occurred. Is that what I envision happening here? Yeah, and this is just going to be something we're going to be dealing with the rest of our lives, right? Where is the line between active, any lay citizen knows all rights have their limits, right? That includes the First Amendment, right? You can't shout fire in a crowded theater, right? So what is the 21st century version of that? Well, spreading disinformation, willful disinformation, is very arguably a version of that. But where is that line between disinformation versus incorrectly interpreted information? The Tom Cotton op-ed. God, it was 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
I think that's a very kind of topical example of that debate, right? It is when and where. To my eye, I agree pretty much entirely with Michelle Goldberg's reaction to that, which is that Tom Cotton's view is fascist, and here's how, and here's why, right? And so where is the line between this needs to be put on public notice because this is whether we like it or not, this is a powerful senator endorsing these ideas, and a certain segment of the population supports these ideas, versus, hey, this is willfully making things worse for us all. It actually doesn't add X, Y, or Z to the public dialogue. It doesn't belong. It doesn't belong. Hopefully, every time we have these hullabaloos, it doesn't become a long affair filled with much hand-wringing and James Bennett has to quit and all that stuff. But that's these kind of figuring out exactly where that line isn't going to be. There's no easy solution out there. There's no panacea. This is just something we're going to be dealing with, I think, forever. Even though I am, I vote blue, and I don't foresee that ever changing, or at least changing for many, many years. I do think it's on people on our side of the aisle too to pay attention to this stuff, to make sure that isn't being enforced so much that the government ends up in full control of speech the way it's nearing in the world of Empire City. That was a really long-winded, vague answer, I realize, but I wish I had a panacea for it. It's not, and I wish it would go away. I wish we could go back to 1999 when everything was perfect and ideal. But
yeah,
we're
exactly.
We're not, and this is our new world, and we're gonna have to pick up. You and I and everybody listening to this, we all have our limits, and sometimes we choose to push back on people we care about. Sometimes we choose to let loose on assholes saying stupid shit. And hey, that's important too. And sometimes I don't know. Sometimes we just got to let it lie, and because we can't fight this constantly. But the fight isn't going away. The fight for information, the fight for truth. We're deep in Orwell land now with that.
Yeah, to me, it felt like there was a detail in that whole thing that I really homed in on, just because of my own politics, but also, as a kind of open parentheses here, having gone through recently in the United Kingdom, there was a general election, and the very, very short summary version of that is that the level of disinformation being put out by the state broadcaster, but also by all of the private news entities as well, was so jarring and shocking to anybody who was involved in the process, who wasn't already, who wasn't on the same side as the state broadcaster, that it really it made it very clear to me that when you have that much power and influence completely divorced from reality and just putting out a line that is in service of one side and not the other, it's really, really hard to fight it. And you find yourself in conversations, me getting rained on, getting screamed at by British pensioners who think that, that Jeremy Corbyn is going to fucking, he's going to collectivize their garden. And I realized how much of an asymmetric a battle that is, how much of an unfair fight it is. And then I think about what you mentioned with Tom Cotton, because the detail that I'm talking about here was that Cotton was basically justifying his argument, saying that the military had to put down the violent terrorist threat of Antifa. But if you clicked on the link, the hyperlink on the web version of that, it then brought you to basically a New York Times almost disclaimer debunking the Antifa myth. But A, who the fuck's going to click on that? And B, it didn't appear in the print edition. And so it's just it felt like the weirdest kind of fudge to me. The idea you'd be like, oh, well, we disproved this, we fact checked this, but it doesn't matter. The guy's a sitting senator, and to the average reader, they're going to read this and it's going to say, by the way, there's this terrorist group called Antifa, and we have to put them down with the military. If you didn't know anything about who Tom Cotton is, you might be like, damn, I didn't realize there was this homegrown terrorist network that's the biggest threat in America right now. And so in a way, it felt so hollow to say, well, hey, we did our due diligence on this, when you see the asymmetry of sitting U.S. senator, military veteran, in the biggest, most widely read newspaper, or one of the most widely read newspapers in America, saying, hey, there's this terrorist group that's, militantly left wing, and then in the fine print you link to it actually it doesn't exist.
Right. Without argument. The biggest fail on that, I think well-intentioned people can argue both sides of whether an op-ed by Cotton should have been published in the pages of the Times, but the op-ed with those fact-checking failures that was published, at least online, everything else is secondary after that, right? Because you willfully publish something that your own news service says isn't true.
Yeah, and to me, it kind of felt like a useful snapshot as far as where we are. That one of the things that we've talked about on this show, and Francis and I have talked about it a lot, we've been doing this almost 4 years now, is that we didn't come into the views on, hey, all the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are failures, and we need to, everything needs to be addressed with that specifically in mind. That wasn't something that occurred to us because of doctrinaire reasons. It was just the point you're at a long enough timeline. You watch people promise, hey, this is going to work, and then it doesn't work, and things continue to get worse, and things don't end. And you say, okay, maybe the only thing that's left for us to do is to stop doing the thing we've been doing for 20 years and admit that we're not going to win. And similarly, to me, which is I'm not trying to put you on the spot with regard to the kind of justification of incrementalism, but that's sort of how I feel now as far as how my politics have shifted, is that if it were going to work, it would have worked, and it hasn't seemed to put out the fire yet. It just seems to be getting worse. And I guess Tom Cotton to me is I forgive me, I can't remember the name, but there's a character in Empire City who is basically a blowhard Fox News talking head Navy SEAL, and it's basically him.
Yeah.
Was it? It's but that's a senator, that makes me feel worse.
He's a conglomerate. Liam Noonan is his name, and he's a conglomerate of a lot of fine assholes we've both engaged with on Twitter.
Yeah.
And with regards to incremental, I'll admit more often than not, and this may lose me some book sales, but so it goes. More often than not, I probably am an incrementalist at heart. But the last, if nothing else, the last 4 years have shown me, and the Obama years showed me this too, is sometimes that's not good enough, and it's easy maybe for me, not unlike Mia, not unlike Sebastian. Maybe it's easy for me because I am a middle class kid. I'm able to write for a living. All these kind of things that come with a certain class and station. It's easy to say these things notionally. When everyday lives and everyday livelihoods are at stake, that demand is real, and that demand is raw, and that demand is not incremental. And not to sound too much like Obama, but that's okay. That's okay. That's part of the deliberation. And one example maybe of my own thinking evolving is I probably I was one of the people that initially when I saw the defund the police tagline kind of recoiled against it. I come from a family of cops on my dad's side. I try to view a lot of these viral videos as much as one can, trying to look for some context. Often, especially recently, there is none to be had, but sometimes there is. But I came around. Smart people convinced me that actually the ambiguity, the power, the shock of that term shows how it's doing its purpose. And I'd like to think that well-intentioned, good faith citizens of all creeds and ideologies and all the rest can still be convinced by smart arguments like that. So if nothing else, my own confused politics and the vacillating between the feel goodness of incrementalism and the urgency of accelerationism is both alive in how I engage with the world in 2020. And certainly in the pages of Empire City.
I'm excited for novel 6 when we meet Antifa Matt Gallagher.
I am slowly coming to. That's true. I'm slowly moving left. So you'll. I'll be. Novel 6 will be from the perspective of a Mayday Front member, probably.
I was going to say, it's Antifa super soldiers. There aren't, to my understanding, without giving away too much of the plot, there is the possibility that there is really very much a character that one could describe as an Antifa super soldier, but there's also other super soldiers. And this is my final question on this is, there's an element to the story that is absolutely the realm of fantasy. I'd call it sci-fi adjacent, if you will. Specifically the volunteers who have whose abilities come specifically from the Cythrax bomb. I will not define that too much because I don't want to give away too much of the plot. But basically, here's the effects of a bomb going off made from minerals from that were mined on an asteroid or in outer space. So the point I get of this question is, the world that you've built has these fantastic elements. Did you feel like that was part and parcel of the world as you were constructing it, as you'd envisioned it, as you worked through the drafts? Or was that something that you felt made sense later on to tie things together? Because I certainly wasn't expecting that. When you described this book to me, I want to say like a solid year-ish ago, I remember you talking about in a couple of exchanges, the function of the sort of legionnaire service equals citizenship, the Legion giving you citizenship, people being recruited from abroad to fight in America's wars. I was not expecting the powers of the volunteers. And so I was wondering how that thought process came about. I mean, I feel like once you get into it, you understand it. Like it doesn't let them solve problems. It just, or rather, it doesn't let them solve all their problems instantaneously. It's not like any problem they encounter, they can snap their fingers and fix with it, but it adds this dimension of things that complicates how stuff plays out. How did that come about in the story?
Yeah, I think I was less interested in the powers themselves, though they are utilized somewhat. Chekhov's gun. You put superpowers in a novel, you got to use them. But I was more interested in kind of the after effects of them, of what they mean to to Mia, to Sebastian, to Jean-Jacques, to the others who have them and utilize them. The where their powers come from, I think is a not, it's a not so subtle allegory to war itself, right? And kind of both the expected effects and then, very much the unintended consequences, both on individual souls and on society at large, right? I think that's why there were points where there is a lot going on in this book, and one point I was like, maybe I just need to get rid of the powers and just focus on the alternate reality of this. And it's something I went through a couple chapters and just pulled that stuff just to see what it looked like. And something was missing. It just felt like, to bring this conversation full circle, kind of that seed of a story that I wanted to tell, these big messy questions of war, and what it means, foreign war, and what it means to a republic, and how it transforms a republic, particularly over a long time. Something was missing, right? There was just something clean and neat and fun about having this have a sci-fi adjacent aspect to it, and it didn't need to be the driving force to the book. Wouldn't surprise me if somebody who saw that expecting X-Men or something, and they're like 200 pages in, or waiting through a long politician speech about democracy. They might be a little disappointed, but then, hey, they're 200 pages in. Joke's on them, and they already bought the book. That's okay. So there was just something missing, because I wanted to tell a story. For all these big ideas and ideals that matter a lot to me and matter a lot to you too. I wanted to write something that was interesting and engaging, and the powers, the sci-fi aspect of it, kind of the mystery origin of it all that readers get different versions of through the course of the book. It just kind of added, I don't know, another layer to it that I enjoyed, and I hope readers enjoy too.
I mean, you could also make the argument that you could interpret it metaphorically, that the experience of combat changing people it's like having a superpower in the sense that, like, it alters your perception of things. And so, I mean, I'm really reaching with this question, obviously, but in a way, like that thought occurred to me that in the story, these aren't metaphorical, these are real powers. But when you get down to it, that these were powers granted by an experience of being in a very unforgettable and traumatizing and galvanizing experience. And so in a way, it's not that far off the mark. It's just you've added that element to it.
Yeah, no, that's right on, man. And they think it's and there's limits to that too, right? Like, they have been transformed and changed by it permanently, right? They have an ability / experience that they didn't have before, that most people in America may not. But they're really kind of still the same people, right? If they were fools before, they're probably still fools. If they were drunks before, the Captain America in here has a drinking problem, a very heavy drinking problem, and that didn't originate with that didn't come from nowhere. That's not something war gave him, though it may be used as an excuse, right? And that may have been taken from some people that I know, that you probably know some of them too. There's limits to that too, of using, a year, 15 months of our lives, one bad day in these characters' cases. There's a lot of truth to using that as something to point to, as a fundamental marker that shaped your life, but there's limits to that too, and sometimes it is too convenient. I've had to remind myself sometimes as a writer, hey, it was just a year, and don't let a year define the rest of your life. It's one thing to be engaged and interested in these ideas and being proud of being a veteran and somehow reconciling that with the shame of serving in a war that went darkly awry. But that's not who I am. That's not how I identify. I'm not. We're not screaming in front of a dashboard truck using as a veteran American, right? That's not a real identity marker. So finding the limitations of that is something that I think some of the characters go through, and some don't, and they end up paying a pretty heavy cost for that. I think by the end of the book.
Well, I really enjoyed reading it. I was going to tell to the listeners, Empire City is available from Atria Books. I will link to it in the show notes of this episode. I will try to link to something where you can buy from a local bookshop to hopefully pay it forward in that regard. Matt, thank you so much for making time once again for your second appearance on the show. I really appreciate you coming on, and thanks again.
Always a pleasure, Nate. Good to be back, and keep giving those British pensioners hell, please.
Yeah, hell yeah.